Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's webinar, Funding Low Attention Disasters, from Preparedness to Long-Term Recovery. My name is Carrie Cullen, and I am the Director of the Midwest Early Recovery Fund at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Previously, I served as a humanitarian special projects team lead at Lutheran Social Services of North Dakota, where I worked on disaster case management and recovery programming, served as a project manager for the Midwest Consortium of Disaster Services, managed special events for New American Services, and initiated and led the agency's work with victims of labor trafficking. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the panel discussion. If you are on X, formerly Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery. That's CDP, the number 4, recovery, to share and join in the discussion. And don't forget to follow us at Funds for Disaster. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings to better meet your needs. And finally, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. Live captioning is available now via Zoom. Click on the closed caption live transcript to access it, and more accurate captions will be in the recording. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Alliance Magazine, the Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, Peak Grantmaking, Philanthropy New York, and United Philanthropy Forum. We want to thank them all for their support. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges that it works on the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders and past, present, and future generations. At the end of this webinar, we hope that grantmakers will understand the different responses between low attention disasters and larger natural hazard events, increase their awareness of the different phases of disasters and how donors can expand their disaster giving to address needs throughout the disaster stages, and learn the importance of blue sky planning to prepare for disasters. So now I just want to take a moment to look at the results of our poll. It does look like we have a lot of votes for media coverage, which makes sense as the #1 reason that some disasters are low attention. There is a lot to do with media coverage, and we will talk some more about that as we continue throughout our conversation today. Geography is also one of the indicators of whether or not a disaster is classified as low attention for us. We do think about the number of people affected. Perhaps maybe we want to think about them in terms of the ratio of the number of people to the population of the community. But these are all pieces that we will touch on as we increase our understanding in this conversation together. So thank you so much for answering those poll questions. I am very excited to chat with our speakers today, but before we dive into that conversation, I want to talk about low attention disasters and why they're important to me, what they are, and then to share a quick example of a community that I'm currently working to bring some attention to. So low attention disasters are most often identified by the following indicators. Sometimes it's all of these indicators, often it's 1 or 2, but we see a limited national or regional media coverage. We see little or no regional or national disaster response. There's a disproportionate impact on marginalized or chronically under-resourced populations. There's often high percentage of damage to housing. For us, we look at, is it 25% or more? There's typically insufficient community infrastructure, capacity, or ability to develop or sustain recovery operations. And often there's no presidentially declared individual assistance offered to the community. Although I will put a caveat on that one, that we are seeing more and more often in my work, especially in the Midwest, that even those disasters where there's individual assistance provided, even in those, there's a lot of low attention areas and a lot of communities within those larger scale disasters that could still be qualified as low attention for our work. So there's some key challenges that happen in every low attention disaster that we've identified through our work with the Midwest Early Recovery Fund. And these are challenges that most communities will face as they think about what that looks like and getting started to move from the initial kind of relief and response into more of a recovery mindset and recovery work. So communities struggle to translate this highly complex system of disaster recovery into actionable steps. They struggle sometimes to coordinate survivor information and ensure the equitable distribution of resources from multiple agencies. There's a challenge to identify and secure sufficient resources to address all the unmet needs of those most vulnerable to the impact of disasters. The challenge of developing and sustaining mid to long-term recovery efforts. And then for us at the Midwest Early Recovery Fund, we prioritize the needs of children. And so we have noticed and note that there is a challenge around meeting those unique needs of children and youth post-disaster. So why focus on low attention disasters? As someone, myself, who works regularly in this low attention disaster space, I have to go back and think about the why often. Why do we focus? Why do we stay here? First, for me and foremost, is that low attention disasters impacts human beings. And I have spoken with numerous communities who say, you're the first one to call, or we didn't think anyone cared, who felt all alone in the midst of a difficult time and event within their community and their space. Also, we know from the research that there's a persistent gap in recovery funds, and that gap gets even greater when we think about communities that do not get the media, government, or philanthropic attention as large-scale disasters perhaps do. One example of some of the research that we've seen is that there's a finding that small or medium scale disasters, in comparison to larger disasters, have a greater impact on household finances. These disasters, although they often and typically impact small or rural isolated communities, also impact urban areas and other non-urban spaces. The complexity of recovery and accessing resources does not change based on the size of the disaster. In fact, without attention, bringing money, people, and materials to community, the complexity often grows. Many of these low attention disasters, especially those that occur in areas with repeated losses, impact communities on the front lines of climate change. These communities cannot bear the burden of recovery alone. And if they don't recover, displacement only continues and the economic challenges grow. And these continue to cause ever widening ripples of loss and impact to communities across the United States and beyond. At the end of the day, for me, it's about equity. It's about taking a person-first, community-centered approach before we think about return on investment or scalability, and working to ensure that everyone, no matter their geography or social economic status, has access to what they need to recover. I want to share with you a quick example of a low attention disaster. We've been working with the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe for several years. The precipitating event for our engagement there was flooding in 2019. The flooding occurred during some of the worst and most widespread flooding that the 10-state region that I work in has ever seen, and it was catastrophic. But this community got lost among many other communities that were also struggling to recover in 2019 from flooding. And then COVID-19 stalled their recovery. And they've had several subsequent storms and events that have continued to damage and repeatedly damage homes in this area. The community is rural and relatively isolated, but it does cover a very large area, roughly the size of Connecticut. As in many disasters, housing is a main concern, and a quick look reveals a history of significant disinvestment and marginalization in the area. None of the disasters that have happened in the Cheyenne River area have made the news media, really, and very little philanthropic investment was made for recovery efforts. They continue to face the same challenges that many communities with low attention disasters face: access to funding, expertise, and volunteers that is culturally appropriate. I want to highlight them, not just because there's a need there, but also because there's great opportunity here. A newly formed community coalition is leading conversations about housing recovery, preparedness training, and climate change in new and exciting ways. And it always amazes me how a little funding in a low attention disaster can get stretched and used to meet so many needs. And I often dream about how more flexible resources targeted to meet the recovery needs of these communities could allow them to think beyond meeting today's unmet needs and into the future. Now it's my honor to introduce our special guests, and I'm looking forward to the information that they're going to share with us. Dr. Joshua Baer is a research professor at Virginia Modeling Analysis Simulation Center at Old Dominion University and program manager at the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience. He conducts studies, performs modeling, and publishes insights related to resilience, catastrophic events, recovery, and supply chain material and labor convergence. This entails leveraging natural systems data to model storms and flooding, build environment data to characterize the physical structures of our communities, and social behavioral data related to population perceptions and behavioral response. Courtney Goss serves as the Texas State Voluntary Agency Liaison. This role oversees statewide volunteer and donations management, disaster nonprofit and philanthropic engagement, and supports long-term recovery in co-ed groups. Courtney has extensive disaster response and recovery experience in both declared and non-declared disasters across the state of Texas, including deployments for Hurricanes Harvey and Imelda. She is passionate about advocating for disaster survivors and equipping communities to build resilience and recover more efficiently. Mark Lindberg is the Program Director, Disaster Relief and Recovery of the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies. Before joining the Philanthropies, Mark was Director of Operations and International Programs for the Medtronic Foundation in Minneapolis. Mark has also worked as a country director in Papua New Guinea and Associate General Counsel for the Peace Corps in Washington, D.C. And in the interest of full disclosure, the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, often called MACP, is the funder of the Midwest Early Recovery Fund, which I manage. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us. I'm excited to jump into this conversation, and we are going to start with the first question for you, Josh. What is Recover Hampton Roads?
Thanks, Carrie, and right off the block, right? Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for allowing me the opportunity to introduce people to Recover Hampton Roads. Very quickly, Recover Hampton Roads is a partnership that we're setting up here in Hampton Roads. We know that vulnerable and medically fragile populations tend to experience extended displacement times, and long displacement times essentially mean an increase in pain and suffering and a decrease in lifespan. Essentially, there's a huge difference in well-being across groups, those that recover fairly quickly and those have long displacement time. So disparities in recovery times across these groups present fundamental equity and justice issues for our society. So if we know these long displacement times are associated with pain, suffering, decreased lifespan, then we're obliged to address this. So Recover Hampton Roads is a partnership, a community-driven collaborative approach to building resilience, but focused on blue skies today, ahead of time, before a storm is even beyond the horizon. What can we do under blue skies to build capacity in our region to prepare for longer-term recovery? And then when an event actually happens, Recover Hampton Roads actually is active in coordinating some of that longer-term recovery and managing the converging material and labor that flows into that region. So in a nutshell, that's pretty much what Recover Hampton Roads is. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. So important to think about those pieces and what we need to do in blue skies to be ready for these to happen. So I look forward to more conversation with you, Josh. We're going to turn to Courtney. In philanthropy, we say, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. Is this the same for disaster?
Absolutely, and thank you for asking, Carrie. The ideas of disaster being unique is often far more complex than initially thought of. There are numerous types of humanitarian emergencies, natural hazards, and severe weather events that our communities may be at risk. Earthquakes to floods to wildfires, tornadoes, drought, thermal extremes. It's when these hazards intersect with a community or society that we see that lives, livelihoods, infrastructure, and environmental impacts and losses that are felt, that they become disasters. It's important to acknowledge that despite the type or even the scope of the event within a disaster, there is a community and there are people that are impacted. And to further add to, again, to that complexity, it's of the disasters that we see, what truly makes them, for me, so distinct, again, is the communities in which they're impacted. The geographical location, the landscape, the culture, the history, what makes them all so unique. It's often, again, each with their own obstacles and challenges. In the recovery space, it can be even hard to fully comprehend. It's known, again, like you mentioned, that disasters have disproportionate impact on lower income persons, families, communities that are underserved, under-resourced, underrepresented. Why I feel so strongly and passionate about at the most local level, both in rural and urban communities, is that we are educating, equipping, and empowering Texans regarding disaster preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation and initiatives is because of the people. I want to quickly mention, I'm a talker, I apologize. I want to quickly mention that the pictures below are of my hometown here in Central Texas that experienced great devastation, loss of life, property due to a flash flood event. As a community member that experienced flooding and severe weather before, I now hear what I heard for so long. We could have never imagined anything happening this bad here. As funders, you may never know the names of individuals that have been impacted by disaster, but they have names, they have stories, they have triumphs, trials, tribulations. They each make up our communities, our tribal territories, our states and nation. And simply put, without philanthropic contributions, they may never fully recover.
Thank you, Courtney. I've heard and I can sense the passion in the work that you do. And so again, excited to hear more as we continue to dive in this afternoon. Mark, we're going to turn the next question to you. Why are low attention disasters a focus for Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And it's great to be with everyone today. Well, first and foremost, we fulfill donor intent by focusing on low attention natural disasters. Apparently, Margaret Cargill was quoted as saying, this was the work that needed to be done, sort of full stop. So on just a primary level, that's a key piece for us. But I think more broadly, I think from an equity point of view, low attention events, you alluded to it in your opening remarks, they frequently occur in places where there's less media, less attention, less awareness of underlying conditions, and less access to resources. And so that seems like a really appropriate place for us to be from a philanthropic point of view. Somewhat relatedly, we've also looked at the data too. Actually, CDP early on in our history helped us look at Tornado Alley and flooding in the Central Plains region of the country, and really where some of these dynamics were playing out. And I think for us, it really reiterated the opportunity to make a difference. In this case, in the Midwest, we've, as you know, have selected 10 states that we focus on, but there are many states, I would argue, that sort of are vulnerable or susceptible to the impact of events that are low attention in nature. Those numbers referred to under the research and recent history piece, bit of a tease. So there were $18 billion disasters in 2022. And probably at some point or another, one of us heard about, some version of most of those. There were 119 weather-related disasters in the country last year. So it just, in a very rough metric, unscientific, but just kind of proportionally gives you a sense of the significance of big events compared to the many, many smaller and lower attention events, typically smaller and lower events that play out across the country.
Yeah, those the $1 billion disaster slide, every time that it's released, always is a little bit overwhelming to me, right? Because we see a lot of the big ones that we've heard of, but there's also all of these other little ones and communities that underlie each one of those events and stories. So thank you for sharing that. Second question for you, Mark. Some people think that low attention means small, but floods can be quite large events. Why do you think they don't get the attention that they need?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, just to acknowledge that really all disasters generate agonizing and traumatic conditions. And so, sort of one type of event doesn't have a monopoly on others. But I do think that there are factors related to flooding, whether they're large or small, that I think kind of cause it to be maybe the quintessential low attention event. From a mortality point of view, thankfully, with the exception of sort of these massive flooding events that we've seen over the years from time to time in places like China, there isn't typically a higher mortality rate associated with flooding. Flooding tends to be slower moving, just in terms of their nature. And so from time to time, we see dramatic videos captured here and there, but on the whole, they tend to be slower moving events. And so may not capture the spirit of media. Once the precipitating event is over, the impact tends to stay around for a long time too. So in that sense, they're not, they don't capture the attention of people, but still exist in some respects. But another factor, I think, maybe especially in the US, is the sometimes invisible nature of them. I've been to many towns and communities, I know you have as well, where from the curb, a house or a building more or less looks okay. But they may have water in them, they may have mold beginning in them. The inside infrastructure may be deteriorating because of water. So for a disaster response and recovery organization, these are no surprises for them. They're professionals and they know exactly what to look for. But I think for the untrained eye, things that might just look fine, in fact, really are holding substantial damage or danger. So when you take all these things together, I think the impact on well-being and households and infrastructure can be severe. And though it might not be newsworthy or to give the media the benefit of the doubt, it's sort of hard to capture succinctly, but they tend to sort of add up to factors that make it lower attention rather than a higher attention event.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we've seen that play out exactly like that in many communities in the area. So thank you so much for sharing that. We are going to turn back to you, Josh. In your planning call, you said all disasters, even the large ones, become low attention disasters after a year or two. What do you mean by that?
Oh, great. Well, I really enjoyed that poll because it was really hard to choose among those different items in the poll. There's a synergistic dynamics among all those items, so it's hard to choose just the one particular item. But I tend to agree that the attention through the media plays a pretty big part. But it's a shiny thing phenomena. I mean, disasters are fairly regular, and unfortunately, we move on to the next shiny thing. Most of the longer term repairs that are necessary to become transition from being displaced back to your familiar, probably your initial home that was damaged. Most of the repairs come from non-government resources. So the longer term recovery, I mean, government's good at initial response and rescue, but the long-term recovery really plays out on the field of nonprofit and faith-based groups. These are the groups that stay in the trenches, and I call it scrapping. 2, 3, 4, 5 years after Florence, there are still some of these faith-based nonprofits. They're out there scrapping to make those repairs years and years after the event. So media coverage drives volunteers and drives donations, and it's difficult 3, 4, 5 years after the event to get those media stories out there. So volunteers love to volunteer, but they're driven partly by what they see in the news, and they will follow the most recent shiny thing chased by the media. So there's a compounding thing happens with this synergistic dynamics. There's a natural cycle of falling away of interest and resources, and collectively we begin to accept that the state of folks that are still struggling, the state of affairs of those folks are the new normal. So the disaster kind of passes on, and it's the low attention disaster. It's no longer a disaster. That's just the new normal, unfortunately. And generally, the most vulnerable and medically fragile households are those that are struggling years after the event to make some of those basic repairs and get situated again.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this idea of scrapping, right? Like using that word as scrappy. That is definitely this sometimes it's a small amount of funds can go a whole long ways when these nonprofits and community organizations are making this work done. So but amazing what we could do if perhaps there was a little bit more for them. So thank you for that. Courtney, in your planning call, you said that connectivity to the resources, especially in these low attention disasters, really does make or break recovery. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, so I want to acknowledge, and I just appreciate all the comments from the panelists and you, Carrie, that recovery is undoubtedly, it's most efficient, most effective when it's a whole community approach. We're talking about all these different, it cannot be, especially when we're looking at a holistic disaster recovery, when we're thinking physically, socially, economically, mentally, emotionally, all the things, it cannot be approached as a responsibility of a single entity or organization. It's true. I love the saying that a heavy load is made light by many hands. Is even with those high attention, with or without state, federal assistance, all disasters begin and end locally. Federal assistance, individual assistance, when made available, is not intended to make a person whole. For context, like we all said earlier, facts show that 90% of weather-related disasters in the U.S. involve flooding. And it's estimated that an inch of water, 1 inch of water, may incur a cost of up to $24,000 in damages. When we look at the national standard for damage assessments, 1 inch of water is barely affected, barely impacted. Yet a few inches of water to a household without flood insurance very well could be absolutely devastating. So for me, again, there's no doubt that Texans are resilient. We take great pride in Texans helping Texans, especially in our rural communities. We even take pride in leading the nation in rural populations. In low attention disasters, particularly those impacting rural communities, again, we see the unbelievable sense of self-reliance, these grassroots efforts, again, neighbors helping neighbors, and this defined unbelievable sense of community that, again, is always humbling to partake in and support. But also we know that prior to a disaster, there's already less access to resources and more limited social support systems than urban populations. And those systems quickly become taxed and overwhelmed in times of disaster. And yes, while rural communities may have less complex local governing systems and structures, again, they're often lacking in manpower and technology. So again, I want to acknowledge in every disaster, philanthropic contributions and connectivity to resources are obviously a very important piece of the puzzle. But in low attention disasters, that connection to resources is vital. And again, often what makes recovery even possible.
Thank you, Courtney. First of all, I'm super excited about this conversation. I think I've said it a couple of times, but I'm always amazed at how all of these answers begin to thread together and how we can pull those things out. And then, this idea that 25 of 1 inch of water equaling $25,000 worth of losses is like it's a challenge for me personally in my own household, but thinking about my neighbors and my community and all of the spaces when I work, that number always takes my breath away because of what that challenge means for us in spaces. So why should funders connect to VALs before and during disasters?
Well, thank you. I go back to when bad things happen, look for the helpers. The voluntary agency liaison role, or the VAL role, predates the establishment of FEMA. The Disaster Relief Act in 1974 assigned 10 special representatives across the nation to coordinate with our disaster response and recovery voluntary organizations to provide technical assistance for donations management and really assist those impacted communities. Over time, this has evolved to what we now know at the federal level as the FEMA VAL cadre. And emergency management industry VALs are that central point of coordination between voluntary, faith-based, and community organizations responding in times of disaster, and our state, our local, our tribal, territorial, and federal governments. So it is important to know and acknowledge that the role of the VAL may look differently from one locality to the next. Not every state has a state VAL, but many do employ state VALs at this time, which I'm very, very thankful to see. Again, they might not be full-time as I am, or part-time or a part of another position, often within the Office of Emergency Management, the State Service Commission, or even the State Human Services Agency. I'm really appreciative that the state of Texas has recognized the value of the VAL role, and we now have 4 regional VALs throughout the state and are looking to add to the team. But again, the purpose of the VAL is to connect the dots, build bridges, to connect those vetted, verified, unmet needs, whether it be money, manpower, material, all within a community, and bring the people and resources together to do the most good for the most people. We laugh because I really am this passionate all the time. It makes a difference. I know the value of the role. I saw it in my own community. Again, I'm so humble and grateful to be able to serve in the role of the VAL, where success is measured by equipping and empowering communities in their darkest hour. And I'd like to say to the funders, again, I encourage you to not only seek out the helpers, whether it's a VAL or another network, but to be a helper and to utilize the expertise, the knowledge, and the relationships of the VAL role and the VOAD network.
Absolutely. Thank you. We, as funders at CDP in our grant making side, we love our VAL connections and the partnership that we've been able to develop. And so, and again, just thank you for being here and sharing today. Mark, why is it important for non-disaster funders to think about entering this space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually going to sort of tee off my comments on the slide that's here. Really, there's 2 messages here. First and foremost, that graphic on the left is the sort of the traditional disaster cycle of sort of these distinct phases before and after an event happens. And so the response and the recovery and mitigation during the recovery, hopefully, and then sort of longer term preparedness work at a community level and elsewhere. But what we're seeing and what we're hearing from our partners are that in many respects, this cycle is being turned on its head or turned upside down. Disaster mission organizations they're sort of increasingly unable to rely on sort of these standard phases or periods of activity. Sort of unpredictability, the increased severity, the increased frequency and intensity of disaster events are really forcing them to sort of stretch operations year-round. Carrie, you know this from your role. They're fundraising more regularly, of course, and some are expanding their mission to new and different areas of activity, from disaster response work to longer-term recovery work, to that sort of broader notion of resilience building and adaptation. So we see folks, again, who used to be able to rely on these sort of fairly predictable pieces, not being in the same space that they used to be. Similarly, then, for donors, I think donors of all stripes, shifting to the right side of the slide, if you will, really, I think we're forced to sort of think about the issues, whether we consider ourselves disaster funders or not. I would be hard-pressed, I've said that before, but I'd be hard-pressed to think of a sector that that's tied to community development that isn't in some way impacted by or could be helping communities adapt or mitigate the impact of disasters and climate change. Equity is also another important consideration. I think organizations such as the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado and Headwaters Economics are carrying out research, are using data that helps us understand not just who is vulnerable, but sort of how and why certain populations are impacted more profoundly than others, mostly low income, indigenous and other communities of color. So these are important variables to both sort of think about in terms of new information, but also if, as a donor, you've been engaged with those communities previously, the impact of disasters is, as I'm sure you're observing one way or another, sort of coming to the fore more and more. So I think both community development and equity are really broad sets of issues, which means sort of there's many doors, there's many windows into this space to provide support and engage in relevant work and sort of still find connections with your primary interest, whether they're driven by donor intent or strategy. I think there's typically a connection with this work and pre-existing priorities.
Absolutely, yeah. The intersectionality of all of disaster within all of these different sectors is so clear to those of us in this conversation. And to make it in our words at CDP, all funders are disaster funders, right? So there is a space for everyone when we're thinking about disaster, to think about where they can fund and what they can do on that. So I have one more question for Josh, and then we're going to move to some audience questions in a minute. So don't forget to use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Josh, funders often contribute to large-scale events such as music festivals and pride events. Let's use this year's Burning Man as an example of what mitigation funders should help contribute to for these events.
Thank you. That was a good setup. So what should funders be thinking about before supporting a grantee? Just a few weeks ago, you may have heard, caught in the news coverage out there about the annual Burning Man event. So my suggestion is, as a funder, ask for the risk management plan, essentially. So here's a quote on this slide. This is a quote from a story that came out shortly after the event. And if you read in it and read between the lines, it mentions risk management. And it says, we did our permits and everything, but we had a bookcase full of contingency plans and we exercised them. We played them out. We exercised. We did tabletop exercises. And in fact, if you look at the bottom of that quote, it mentions that Secretary of State, their risk management efforts, the risk management plan is admired and studied by other groups to be replicated. So how should the funders think about it? I think you think about asking and digging down below the hood and examine that risk management plan of that group. Here in this slide, I'd like to share with you, this is the burden of the beast. It's a fantastical full art structure. As you know, Burning Man Foundation supports artists, and those artists come out to the event and they build these displays out there. This is a Walter Babington. He's from New Orleans, Louisiana, and he submitted a rendering here and got it funded. And the idea was to use lumber from Katrina, pieces of lumber and scrap lumber, and build this thing he called the Burden of the Beast, and to take it out there to Nevada and set it up. And here's a quote from the artist down below in the corner there. It's as if the pieces had fallen home and they had sentience and some will to collect what they could together, come together, stand up and head towards higher ground. And as a society, we are heading figuratively towards higher ground. We're making progress, meaning that we're lowering risk posed to our populations, especially vulnerable populations. So the head towards the higher ground phrase here, and this image is, for me, representative of our collective bigger picture drive to build resilience during blue skies, well before a storm is on the horizon, as I mentioned earlier. So the Burning Man Foundation, in a sense, is part of that bigger picture, building resilience, building blue sky resilience in anticipation or ahead of some catastrophic event. And they're doing that by increasing awareness. So I was at Burning Man, and I was out in the Black Rock Desert, and I was riding my bicycle across the desert. And I came across, here's Walter Babington's sculpture out there, very similar to the artist rendering you saw on the previous slide. And I took this picture. And you notice the storm, if you follow the news, a storm came through, several storms came through, and it really rained during Burning Man. And you can see this picture, the wind is blowing from the behind, and the light in front of the beast is swinging. And you can see on the ground the moisture and the dry spots as the storm moved in. Well, I crawled up into that the belly of the beast up there and took a shelter. Well, so my point here is I want you to think about the multiple pathways, the whole community approach, the different things you can do as a foundation to help collectively build that resilience. In this case, the Burning Man Foundation, through supporting local artists, is raising awareness about the need to build resilience and reduce risk and move away from those risky areas. And of course, that's a picture of me in the bottom. And 4 days later, I survived, and I'm here.
There you go. And we are glad. Thank you so much for that story and that example of what that looks like. So we did receive several questions in advance, and I'm going to work through that list. And then we have, as well as any that we've had in the question and answer box. As a reminder, CDP webinars are aimed at providing education for the philanthropic community. So while all are welcome to ask a question, we will first focus on those that are addressing funder issues. And we are going to start with you, Mark, with this question in the question and answer box. It says, my country has been facing floods every time we have long rains, and victims will be provided with donations. However, is there any sustainable solutions that you've come up with to help survivors?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a complex question, I think. The fact that the persons in a community that's affected by floods regularly helps give one a chance to sort of be looking at early warning systems, for example. And though on a household basis, those might be hard, but plugging into communities and the way they organize to either develop early warning systems by or for themselves, or with local government actors is one way to reduce the impact of disasters like that we know are coming on a regular basis. I think what we've seen too is that there are opportunities to support certain livelihoods type activities that help reduce the impact of events when they do happen, so they're less vulnerable to floods or storms that are regularly in place. Think just basic things like planning too. I'm sure that if you're in a community that's been affected over and over, you're already doing some of these things, but we've been surprised sometimes that communities that are in these circumstances still they're not quite organized yet. They don't quite have a plan. They don't know, things like escape routes, let alone things that require a little bit more thought around the livelihoods piece, as I mentioned earlier. So I think we've also been trying to engage local organizations as much as possible. We really think in the last 2 or 3 years have really come to understand the importance, or really reiterate the importance of local actors. And so we've really tried hard to support capacity strengthening where there's a need, where there's a desire. And that's hopefully part of the solution. The more that those local actors are present and have got capacity, they in turn will be able to work at a household and individual basis to really help people manage through these regular events in their areas.
Thank you. Just curious, Josh or Courtney, do you have anything to add along those lines? I will go to the next question then. So several people, Courtney, have asked about how to get public officials to help, and I would expand that to even how do you get attention? How do you when there's a need, how do you get others engaged in the conversation?
As I mentioned earlier, everyone has a seat at the table. Disaster recovery is best when it is a whole community approach. For public officials or for local community stakeholders, whoever it may be, I would encourage them to continue to break down the silos, that we have to continue to engage with those local community stakeholders. We have to continue to tell the story, but in doing that, we have to continue to equip and empower to be able to actually do that. So what do? We got to tell the story, and we got to do it in a way that, again, both shows data, but also tells the heartfelt, these are families, these are people that have been impacted by disaster. So it's balancing the data and balancing the dialogue.
Absolutely. Josh, a question for you. A few people have asked, how do we get funding for prevention and mitigation, which we know usually receives 2 to 4% of funding each year? Recover Hampton Roads works in that space. So how do you think about funding needs there?
Wow, yeah, it always comes back to money, right? So what you really do is you got to develop a coalition. The phrase of the day seems to be whole of community approach, and I can't agree with that more. You got to create a coalition. That coalition for funding, it isn't just about money, but it's about support. So you may have individual contributions, you may have corporate donors, you may have your regional foundation. Here we got Hampton Roads Community Foundation, but there's other things that people can contribute to support that whole community. Advice and guidance, providing access to stakeholders. You know, a lot of the needs that are present today, food insecurity, health, well-being, those type of things, there are nonprofits that are in alignment to serve or meet those needs under blue skies. Well, those in a recovery event, those needs are still there: food insecurity, health, well-being, those type of things, and they're just exacerbated greatly during that environment. So networking with those nonprofits, and you may not be able to financially get money, but having access to those stakeholders, they know the communities they serve. That's a tremendous asset. So advice and guidance, inventory control system from the box stores. If you want to track materials coming in, they may not be willing to provide dollars, but they may be able to provide access to your inventory control system. So there's a lot of different things you can ask your partnership, that whole community approach. Ask people to put skin in the game other than money. So it's building that whole of community approach. Everyone have a little bit of skin in the game to the best of what they can offer, and that's how we make it work here in Hampton Roads. It all is about building capacity through including all those different stakeholders.
Thank you. Courtney, a question that I'm going to start with you. Have you found that there are a lot of community organizations that are in place already when a low attention disaster occurs? Or how do you usually find them?
Yeah, so I have the fortunate opportunity to be able to deploy boots on the ground in times of disaster. And I will always encourage that we build upon what is within that local community, that social infrastructure. We have amazing faith-based and community partners that play a critical role in our communities each and every day. Let's build upon it, and what already works, what's trusted. It's definitely a best practice, the lessons learned. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, work smarter. However, again, we also need to, the other side of it, need to realize that, again, there are limited capacity. And so being able to identify what works within that community, those amazing organizations, being able to, again, a lot of it's just meeting people, finding out who's willing to step up to the plate and say, I want to play a role in this. Those emergent leaders in times of disaster. Ideally, we get them involved prior to. But in times of response, being able to have that connection, and then being able to, again, show that everybody has a seat at the table.
Yeah, I often, just to echo that, I often also find in spaces where there's maybe not a formal nonprofit organization that's stepping in, that there's always individuals and community leaders that are doing that. And so then as a funder, it's on us to figure out how to get creative and flexible and to work alongside communities in order to get them what they need in a way that they can receive it. So we do a lot of work on the front end as well to build up some of those communities where there's not a fully formed nonprofit sector perhaps working, but there are people and individuals that need that support to make that happen. So Mark, we've focused a lot on domestic situation in our conversation today, although there have been a few comments around international pieces, but there are a couple other questions around that international space. How much is this a concern outside the US, and how should funders think about that, and what should funders do about that?
Yeah, and the concern is around low attention, you think? Yeah, I think it's a major concern. I think part of it is finding a handful of resources that you can track or follow just to sort of understand what's going on out there. I think part of it too is a modality related to funding. And so we have enjoyed some success with this idea of pre-positioning funds. So making a grant to an organization who in turn is sort of monitoring circumstances, both from an event point of view, but then operationally or even strategically, where are the best places, when is the best time, and what is the right organization to sort of provide a sub-grant or support to. And so I think how one goes about it is important too. And but the numbers are comparable for sure in the international sphere. And so there's countless sort of low attention events out there. I think the connecting with organizations that are sort of doing this paid work in order to track those is an important thing. I was struggling to remember what I was going to say, but what I was going to say is we're not set up to be operational 24/7. We have a small staff. We're blessed with resources, but we don't have folks to sort of be monitoring events around the world all the time. Just as the same in the US too, though we're more aware of them just given the proximity. So similarly to our commitment to working with CDP, for example, we've pre-positioned funds, back to that idea, we've pre-positioned funds with a handful of organizations that do track these things. And again, back to those other pieces I mentioned earlier. So that's an approach that I think has worked for us, that allows us to have some sense of confidence that with such shared focus, shared interest around low attention, typically natural hazards, that we're at least going to be making a difference in some communities around the world affected by these low attention events.
Thank you, Mark. Josh, a question for you. It's a little bit long one. It's the question answer box. So notions of resiliency often respond to specific short-term acute disasters like flooding and their long-term impacts. This typically less visible are the underlying chronic conditions destabilizing communities over long periods and compounding harm. Acute and chronic destabilizing events exacerbate one another. How might we reconcile the two while serving community partners?
Boy, that's a big question.
That's why I gave it to you, because I figured.
Okay, great. So I think again, what the folks that are most vulnerable today under blue skies, big surprise, but they're the most vulnerable in terms of longer term, mid and long term recovery. And so capacity building has to do with raising awareness. And what we need to do a better job of is telling compelling story and connecting the dots for the return on investment in investing in under blue sky efforts to prepare for eventual recovery. And so you're competing for funding, and there is a lot of pressing current needs that are demanding for this funding. And if you want to get funders to invest in capacity building under blue skies for an event that may not happen for years, for decades, right? You have to have a really, really good, compelling story. You got to have data, and you got to connect the dots for that story. The media is going to be interested in raising these issues about disparities and inequities and the disparate impact of storms on particular vulnerable populations. If you can tell a compelling story, if you can have data, if you can connect the dots for them, and you can show that these populations that are suffering under blue skies currently, the underserved communities, their suffering will be magnified several fold in a longer term recovery. And if you can show that, I come from a modeling simulation center, and we grew out of Joint Forces Command. It's a military thing, but a lot of modeling simulation in the military. what we're able to do is apply some of that natural systems modeling and social behavioral modeling and built environment to show that under different storm scenarios, how some populations years later are disproportionately suffering. So we're connecting those dots with data to make a more compelling story, and that raises the interest of the media, raises awareness across the community, and that helps with raising funds, essentially. It has to be a really compelling story to get people to divert funds from current pressing needs to some future need that may not happen for decades. So that's, I don't know if I directly answered, but that's the best I could do. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions today. I could continue this conversation for much longer, but it's time for us to begin to wrap up. And I want to provide the audience with some actionable thoughts from our conversation. First, disaster phases are not linear. Recovery begins as soon as and really before a disaster happens. Chronic disasters mean a community may be going through a new disaster while still recovering from a previous one. Look at how to build capacity through your grants and allow flexibility for needs to change. Second, relief and response receive the most money, but that doesn't mean those are the only needs. Structural changes for mitigation and adaptation are expensive, as is long-term recovery, but investment in mitigation saves money later. Building back better and creating more resilient housing will reduce disaster impact in the next disaster. Low attention doesn't mean low needs. As you've heard today, many disasters become low attention as soon as the next disaster happens. Small and rural disasters may have costs urban centers don't have because of the distance to transport supplies and the need for external labor. We can fund journalism to help keep attention to a disaster in the media, build partnerships to help manage various needs. You can find many resources that can assist you on CDP's website. From our issue insights to our disaster profiles to our disaster philanthropy playbook, CDP provides numerous resources for those planning disaster funding. There is a monthly newsletter full of information and regular blogs, including our weekly What We're Watching blog that highlights disasters around the world. CDP staff is always available to provide guidance, and if you need a more in-depth assistance, we also provide various consulting services. You can find more information about our work at disasterphilanthropy.org. Our next webinar will be at 2 p.m. Eastern on November 9th, and we'll be discussing Indigenous land management, decreasing disasters, and increasing resilience. In order to respect everyone's time and keep this to an hour, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's webinar. I just want to thank again our co-sponsors and to Josh, Courtney, and Mark for taking the time to share their insights with us. We'd ask you to please take a moment to complete the post-webinar survey and let us know what you liked and what you would like to see in future webinars. It will pop up automatically when you exit this webinar. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.